Welcome to your deep dive. I know you all have been super curious about how countries actually become economic powerhouses.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more interesting than it might seem at first glance.
It totally is.
Yeah.
And we're really lucky to be diving into economist Ha-Joon Chang's book, Kicking Away the Ladder today.
Oh, great pick. That book really flips the script on how we think about economic development.
It really does. And get ready for some serious aha moments, because it turns out the climb to the top is way more, shall we say, strategic than you might expect.
Yeah, strategic is a good way to put it. There are a lot of myths out there about how countries become economic powerhouses, and Chang really digs into those.
Like that whole story about Britain's Industrial Revolution being this perfect example of free trade and open markets.
Right, that one. The truth is way more complicated.
So spill the tea. What's the real story?
Well, the free trade Britain narrative, it kind of skips over a crucial detail. Britain only really embraced free trade after it was already the world's economic superpower.
It's like claiming victory after you've already secretly moved the finish line closer to yourself.
Exactly. Chang actually found that in the 1840s, Britain had tariffs on over 1,000 different goods. Can you believe that?
1,000. Seriously.
Yep, 1,000. But then, just a few decades later, that number plummets to almost nothing. Why the sudden change?
Yeah, it's not like they suddenly had a change of heart and decided to play fair.
Well, by that point, British industries were so advanced that they could pretty much outcompete anyone on the planet. Free trade suddenly became very, very convenient for them.
So it was less about a pure love for free markets and more like, hey, we're winning now. Might as well open up the game on our terms, of course.
Precisely. And this whole kicking away the ladder thing, it's not just a British thing either. Chang shows how it pops up again and again throughout history. Like, look at the rise of England's wool manufacturing industry back in the 14th to 16th centuries. Back then, wool was like the high-tech industry of its day, and England was determined to keep its weaving technology a secret.
Okay, so we're going way back. Tell me more.
So they even banned the export of raw wool at one point. Can you imagine the audacity?
Wow, talk about protecting your advantage. You don't see that happening too often these days.
It's a classic example of what economists call infant industry protection. You got to shield those up-and-coming industries until they're strong enough to compete on the world stage.
It makes sense, right? It's like you wouldn't throw a kid who's still learning to swim into the ocean without any floaties and expect them to just figure it out, right?
Exactly. It's about strategically nurturing industries, not just throwing them to the wolves and hoping for the best.
It's like they were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
Yeah, they were definitely playing the long game. But it makes you wonder, while Britain was off building its empire with a little help from protectionism, what was going on across the pond? Weren't the Americans supposed to be all about that free market life?
You'd think so, right? I mean, that's how the story usually goes.
Right. But in reality, the U.S. was kind of a protectionist rock star in its early days. Like, while Britain was out there preaching the gospel of free trade to everyone else,
Right. Yeah.
they were busy slapping tariffs on imported goods, sometimes as high as 60%.
Whoa, 60%. That's kind of hardcore.
It was. And don't forget, shipping things across the Atlantic back then, that was no walk in the park.
Yeah, that adds a whole other layer of difficulty.
Exactly. So the cost of transportation basically acted as like this extra layer of protection for those young American industries. It wasn't just about tariffs. It was about creating this whole environment where American businesses could like really take root and thrive.
It makes you wonder, like, if those American industries hadn't had that kind of buffer, would they have been able to grow? Would America be the economic powerhouse it is today?
It's a good question. And what's really interesting is that this whole approach wasn't exactly a secret back then.
Oh, really? Like people were openly talking about it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Chang talks about how some of America's leading economists at the time were straight up advocating for protectionism, like guys like Daniel Raymond and Henry Carey. These weren't exactly fringe voices.
Hold on. So while Britain was out there saying free trade is the only way, their own economic rivals were like, we're good.
Pretty much. These American economists, they were arguing that just exporting raw materials would keep the U.S. economically dependent on other countries, and they weren't afraid to challenge the dominant narrative of the time.
Which, you got to admit, is pretty ballsy when you think about it.
Totally. It really makes you wonder, like, what other economic perspectives have we lost or just, like, straight up ignored throughout history, you know?
It's like we only ever get to hear one side of the story.
It's true. Speaking of shaking things up, Chang doesn't just stop at tariffs.
Okay, there's more.
Oh, yeah. He uncovers this whole wild world of, like, Industrial espionage.
Wait, seriously? Like spies and secret agents and stuff?
Well, maybe not exactly James Bond, but you get the idea. Back then, knowledge was power, and countries were willing to get a little, let's say, creative to get ahead. Like, Britain was obsessed with keeping its technological advancements under wraps. They even made it illegal for skilled workers to emigrate.
Wow, they were serious about it. Talk about a brain drain.
Right. But then Chang tells this amazing story about Prussia. They
Yeah.
were luring skilled weavers away from Britain with promises of free looms. And looms back then, that was like the hottest tech gadget.
It's like a historical bidding war for talent.
Exactly. And then there's Alexander Hamilton, a founding father, and apparently a master of industrial espionage. Chang talks about how he organized these whole spy networks to snag industrial secrets from Britain.
Okay, now this is way more exciting than how they taught economic history in school. So it wasn't just Prussia and America then.
Oh no, not even close. Chang shows how it was happening all over the place. Countries were borrowing ideas and technology from the leading nations left and right.
Borrowing, with air quotes, I like it.
Right. It's just funny, because today we have all these strict intellectual property laws and international agreements.
Yeah.
But back then, things were a lot more, shall we say, fluid.
A little more adapt and adopt kind of thing.
Exactly. And Chang makes this really interesting point about how all these now developed countries, the ones who are so gung-ho about protecting intellectual property today,
Yeah.
well, they weren't always so strict when they were the ones playing catch-up.
It's almost like they climbed to the top of the ladder and then pulled it up right behind them so no one else could follow.
It is, and that brings us to the heart of Chang's whole argument. This idea of kicking away the ladder.
Right, yeah.
It's like once a country manages to reach a certain level of economic dominance,
They changed the rules of the game.
exactly, they start dismantling the very tools and strategies that help them get to the top, making it way harder for anyone else to follow the same path.
So it's not just about climbing the ladder, it's about making sure no one else can reach you once you're up there.
Exactly, and that begs the question, what does all this mean for developing countries today?
It's kind of like finding out the Olympics have always had this secret set of rules, right? So knowing what we know now, how should this change how we think about developing economies today? Is Chang saying they should just like dust off those old playbooks, bring back the tariffs, the espionage, all that?
It's not quite that simple. Chang's isn't saying we should just go back to some kind of economic Wild West. He's not saying, go steal all the blueprints and call it a day. It's more about being more aware, more critical.
Those success stories we always hear.
Exactly. We can't just copy-paste economic policies like they're going out of style. The context matters. The timing matters.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Exactly. What worked for one country 100 years ago, it might totally backfire for a different country today,
Makes sense. So if we're trying to wrap our heads around all this, right?
Yeah.
This whole kicking away the ladder thing, knowing that the rules have always been a little, shall we say, flexible?
Definitely flip.
What can we actually do with that knowledge?
Yeah.
It feels kind of empowering in a weird way.
It should. Because now you can ask better questions. You can challenge those simple narratives people throw around about economic development, like free trade is always good, end of story, or intellectual property rights, those are set in stone.
Because even those, as you were saying before, they've totally changed over time.
All the time. History is never black and white, no matter how much we want it to be.
Right, so it's more about shades of gray.
Exactly. Chang wants us to see the nuances here. There's not just one path to economic success, What matters is finding the approach that makes sense for your situation, your goals.
And maybe, just maybe, by looking at how countries actually develop, not how we're told they develop,
Right.
maybe we can find even better ways to do things.
100%. It's not about pulling up the ladder behind you. It's about building a longer ladder so everyone has a chance to climb, right?
Now you're speaking my language. This has been amazing. Seriously, who knew economic history could be this interesting? I feel like we both need to update our reading lists after this.
Oh, sure. I've got a few more books in mind already.
Well, on that note, a huge thanks to you for guiding us through all of this. It's been truly enlightening. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us for this incredible deep dive. It's time to rewrite those economic narratives one chapter at a time. We'll see you in the next one.